Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Today, we are very excited to be joined for the first time by Cory Waggoner, founder and CEO of Higher Yields Cannabis Consulting. Excited to spend some time talking about what he is seeing from the ground level, and of course, discuss sort of the general cannabis theme as we go along. No worries. We had a little bit of a testing for safety for fire alarm going through. So if we have some audio, just we'll kind of keep track of that. But a good reminder, if you're out there and joining, if you have questions or comments, always a good reminder. You can throw them in the chat. I know we'll cover a good amount as we're going along, but it's always a good opportunity to be able to connect, see different perspectives in the cannabis space, and I think get a kind of broader understanding of and perspective of where we are, because it is a very interesting time. I know we've talked about it for people who've been joining this week, but a lot of eyes have been on cannabis. So it's very interesting, and we will get into it. Cory, I'm guessing you're still walking through some of the audio stuff. So let me see if there's some good comments. I see Baz there. Skip, great to see you. See Stevie in there as well, which is awesome. Thanks for joining, guys. So maybe I think what we'll start with, I know we have, some audio to contend with, but I feel like just because it's your first time on, would love to start with, background, history, what really brought you into the space, and because you've been doing it a while. So I would love to start there.
Yeah. So I started back in 2008 in California and in Colorado. I was one of the early pioneers in the cannabis space, first opening grows and stores. Really in those early years, everyone was trying to kind of figure out, what we were all doing and how to scale this and make it a commercialized type of industry. So all of us were really new to it. But from day one, my approach has always been to treat cannabis like a serious business and identify some of the gaps and really support the industry as a whole and being able to move forward in a sustainable way. And a lot of that really started with compliance and licensing, but also as the industry continued to grow, a lot of awareness and a lot of focus on like internal governance and structure and really how to create and build sustainable programs from a government perspective as well as an operating perspective.
That's fantastic. So how to bring cannabis into kind of that next, chapter into a mature, business and overall theme, I think is important. Out of curiosity, what, made you identify the cannabis theme as something that even could go there, could have that opportunity so relatively early? What sort of drew you in?
I've always been a big advocate for the plant and plant medicine as a whole, and I think having some experience with the plant and just seeing how much help it can be to people. I think my drive was really to make sure that the people had the education they needed to understand what impact the plant could have for them, but also helping drive the ability for people to be able to acquire these products, not just here in Colorado and in California, but also as the industry continued to expand, throughout the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah. A very present view. I feel like that's exactly what the conversation is around right now, is sort of how to give people, good access to the plant, whether it's from a medical perspective or recreational as well. And I do think it requires businesses in the space to operate in a way that most standard businesses operate in. It's moved out of kind of the back alley deals and things like that into this more mature, business. So I think that's great, and great to see the support that you're lending some of these operators. So great to see. In terms of, efficiency and what you've seen so far, you mentioned there were a lot of kind of areas that you're trying to help cannabis businesses get into a standard for. What were sort of the original biggest operational gaps when you first kind of joined? And would love to hear if that's changed at all.
I think a lot of it was just around operating systems and engineering. Since it was new and compliance was new, there were a lot of ways to kind of interpret rules and regulations different from state to state, country to country, and building your operating system around those things to make sure that you are adhering to all of the compliance requirements, but also creating procedures that allow you to achieve the greatest level of efficiency. That was a big gap. We saw a lot of people over-regulating themselves, some people not regulating themselves enough. And then in the engineering side of the house, really how we design these facilities, because at that time, most people were growing in basements or growing outdoors or growing in small greenhouses, where in today's market, we have 25,000, 50,000, 100,000 square foot facilities. And these require a lot of really advanced technology and advanced engineering that otherwise hadn't really been seen before. And a lot of the equipment that we were using in the early days and even today wasn't necessarily created for these types of purposes. So it's been really cool to see the technology advancements in indoor farming and the way that cannabis has helped drive that change and those advancements, not just for our space, but also for sustainable indoor farming for general food security.
Very cool. So being able to really find that scale, and I imagine if you're a very small grow, if you're wasting a liter of water, it doesn't really matter as much versus when you have, like you're saying, that you know, 60 million acre farm or something where you really need to watch every area of efficiency, and that really can make some big differences rather than on a small scale. So I think great to be able to bring those cannabis companies and really find some good growth and efficiencies there. So that makes sense. In terms of the types of clients you're working with, who would you describe as sort of the best fit for, the work that you're doing with higher yields right now?
Well, we do a lot of work with multi-state operators, really those seeking to get away from the idea of just writing big checks for new technology to magically fix performance, and more so those really trying to figure out how they can streamline operations. And what we find a lot of times with the multi-state operators is just issues within kind of change management and overall like communication breakdowns between the actual operators and upper management teams, maybe a lack of support. There's been a lot of what we've seen in the last few years is really a misalignment of goals and priorities based on some downsizings that were done. So groups still trying to do all the things they were trying to do with staffs that are 60, 70% as big as they were before. And then we do a lot of work with tribes and social equity programs. So a lot of the tribal work that we've been doing over the last couple of years has been really cool and really rewarding to come in and work with a group who is really focused on community development and diversifying their economic development portfolios. And it's really, really interesting work to come in and help kind of better develop the leadership teams, as well as creating these programs, in areas where there hasn't been a lot of attention.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig more into kind of the tribe aspect because I think that's something, a lot of our followers might not be as in tune with, and I think there's some interesting differences and ways of approaching it there, even though ultimately it is the same goals. So I'd love to hear more about that in a bit. But I would love to, talk a little bit about kind of how you're balancing. It sounds like managing team, shift, labor, all those things. But I know a big thing for cannabis companies right now is focusing on kind of managing the patchwork of regulations that we're seeing across states and different things like that. How do you best stay on top of how those are changing, advising the companies to best adjust? What are sort of the stories, in that vein?
Yeah, there's changes, from a regulatory standpoint. It's really how it impacts the market. So some states are very competitive. Some states are very progressive in how they hand out licenses. The ones that we see that are more progressive are oftentimes not as regulated as well as those are more conservative. But also those markets, while they're easier to get into, they also saturate much faster. Whereas the more restrictive programs, they're a little bit harder to get into. The licenses have a lot more value. It's much easier to protect your market share. But those regulations in those states make it very difficult to even get to market. So as those things change, those are kind of things we keep an eye on of how viable is it for a state to open up new programs like we've seen in Florida where 8, 9 years ago they opened it up to the first operators. Those operators have pretty much been given a chance to take over the entire state. And while there are new programs that have opened up in Florida, it's made it very difficult for new operators to be able to get in. So for those who were in that market earlier, regulatory challenges, regulatory changes don't have that big of an impact to them because of the market share that they hold. Whereas in smaller or more progressive programs, like say in Oklahoma or California, regulations can really hinder a business because of how efficient they have to be operating in order just to maintain either breaking even or making small profits. So for us, it's really understanding the overall market and what regulatory impact may or may not have on an operator and how we can help them streamline that, but also assess it from an operational perspective and internal governance of how we kind of make the secret sauce, for say in some of these spaces to make sure that if there is a regulation that's been put in place or if there is something from a regulatory standpoint that benefits an operator in one state, is it something we should apply to other states and create that part of our standardization?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, is it laying out mostly sort of the give and take of what you get by being in different footprints, different states, or is it recommending? Is it more strongly recommending? Here's why you might want to avoid a certain state, or here's why a state might be attractive at this point in time. What's sort of the range of consulting ultimately that these companies are getting?
Yeah, for those just starting, absolutely. We generally walk people through kind of a feasibility study of understanding what that program looks like, where it
Mhm.
is in its maturity, how early it is, where the opportunities might be, whether they're in cultivation or retail or extraction, or maybe but there's advantages to being a first mover in some spaces. Sometimes it's not to your advantage to be the pioneer. So supporting people and really understanding budgets, timelines, resources, and ramifications of changes or additional rounds of licensees maybe being opened up, or additional social equity programs and things like that. So really helping them understand, kind of the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats of moving into some of these new territories and starting a business in them.
That makes sense. So really setting the table in terms of what they need to understand and having them make their own decisions based on that. But I know it's a lot to keep track of between all the 50 states. So I think having that information really informs good decisions. So I think that's great. You mentioned Florida, you mentioned Oklahoma. Out of curiosity, are there any states that, sort of stand out to you as interesting opportunities? Again, I know you can't give away all your secret sauce in terms of where you might point somebody. But I feel like we've seen a lot of news, whether it's Virginia, or what could happen in Pennsylvania. Just curious if there are any states that stand out to you as interesting developing.
For me right now, a lot of where our interest is in the international markets. I think here in the U.S., a lot of things that we used to be kind of sacred knowledge are now common knowledge. How to grow plants, how to rotate a garden, or how to brand yourself, how to stand out, how loyalty programs benefit you. So I think the U.S., there's only so many states that can legalize, and I think the longer it takes these last few states to legalize, the less of a boom or an impact that you're going to get. Different than what we saw in Colorado when it legalized adult use, and the boom we saw in California and New Jersey. Those were all really big states, and really kind of early on, West Coast, kind of Midwest and East Coast that really did well in these markets. Whereas the ones we're seeing come on now, Minnesota, for example, we're really seeing kind of a slow roll to that program in rolling out. A lot of it is the amount of licenses that are being issued, but also the amount of investment that's coming in. I think overall the buzz of cannabis in the world of investment and finance is kind of started to wear down quite a bit. People are a lot more cautious of what they're investing in. People are a lot more cautious of the models they're looking at and the projections for these states, and how long some of these booms will last versus how long they lasted 5-10 years ago in some of the newer states.
Yeah, interesting. I definitely think indiscriminately throwing money at a theme is not necessarily the way that it's going to work. I think people should be much more kind of careful and diligent where they're placing their dollars. It is great. I know we'll talk about it later on, to see kind of the resurgence of interest and focus on federal legalization, or not legalization, rescheduling and reclassification. So I think that has added something. But you're right. I do think the international or global side of things has been really interesting as well. Any particular countries or markets you'd pull out? I know Germany has been a big focus, I think, lately, but just curious.
Yeah, Europe is really starting to get going. We saw some early movements in places like Uruguay and Australia, some stuff in South America. So, but the issue a lot of times has been being able to move those products outside of those countries, and less moving them out and more so moving them in. So EU GMP certification has been something that's slowed down a lot of operators and a lot of product from being able to make it into the European Union, and making it out of certain countries to make sure that they have those certifications, or they're able to get those certifications, or they're able to move them into facilities that are EU GMP certified, and how to go about that. So there's a little bit of nuance and some massaging that has to be done to be able to move these things around. But overall, Canada was one of the early first movers as well. But outside of those, Europe has been a little bit slow. A couple years ago, 3 years ago, we were really excited to see some of the countries starting to work together, specifically around criminal enforcement, how they were going to enforce things, because borders change so quickly as you go across Europe, and similar to they do here in the US, it's been one of our major issues in being able to push the industry forward much faster. it seemed like Europe was kind of headed towards that same idea of trying to standardize certain rules and regulations that would help them push the industry forward. However, what we're seeing now is similar to what we see here in the U.S., where each state has their own specific rules and regulations. Europe is kind of seeking to do the same thing now.
Interesting. Well, again, hopefully that does get kind of cleaned up just because I think a cleaner regulatory framework makes it easier, like you're saying, for these companies to do well and succeed in these different markets. But in the meantime, I do think being able to provide that expertise, that knowledge can be helpful for companies that are trying to navigate it because it is, a mountain of information and red tape to navigate. So I think that's a great value add there. Seeing a question, which is great. Awesome. Love this. From Stevie, any thoughts on what might be ahead for Texas? I don't know if you have any specific thoughts on Texas, but just curious.
Yeah, I believe Texas, what I read was they're about to open their program up. Currently, they have a very highly restrictive medical program, but it does seem like the movement for cannabis in Texas has been a positive one over the last 4 years. So I assume that in time they will eventually expand their medical program and maybe within a few years of that open it up for recreational. But I don't see it starting for adult use in the next 2 or 3 years. It's probably going to be closer to 4 or 5.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair enough. I think that's an interesting one just because I imagine um, as you're looking at states like Texas, it's probably difficult for operators to try to want to position to be ready, but not want to jump in too early or too late. So I think having that information ahead of time can be really, really helpful. So great. Hopefully we see that in Texas. But yeah, I don't think that's too far off necessarily in terms of how long that could take. All right. Well, then I would love to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about the Native American tribe element of things, just because that's something that we haven't really focused on that much when we've had these Nooners. So I'd love to get a sense of kind of, the work you're doing there and how it differs from kind of the more standard, markets you're working in the US or abroad.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess Minnesota, we've done quite a bit of work with about a dozen tribes across the country. And we see different things in different states and um, how well the states and tribes work together. Minnesota has actually been the state that I feel has the best relationships between tribes and governments, and it's been one of kind of the biggest surprises I think for us working there, especially the advantages that they've been given with being able to start a little bit early and creating their own regulations on their sovereign land and working through compact agreements with the states. But also to their advantage has been kind of the slow program rollout because it's allowed them to position themselves better and get a head start and first mover opportunities compared to some of the others that are just getting licensed now and are just finding properties and are just starting construction, who probably won't be cash flowing for the next 6 to 12 months. A lot of these tribes are already well positioned, producing product, cash flowing, have retail operations set up. So that's been really cool to see the tribes and kind of these disadvantaged communities being able to leverage the opportunities that exist. And for us, I think the tribal development and social equity programs are definitely some of our most rewarding work that we do at Higher Yields, mainly because of the economic development, the leadership building and training that we do within these organizations, and really just the diversification in communities that have been overlooked over the years. Our work in Minnesota, we've been there for about 4 years. We've helped one of the tribes create their entire program, the regulatory development, their compact negotiations, design their facility. We've helped them staff it. We've helped them launch it. And the goal has always been to design it, build it, operate it, and then train the tribe to make sure that it's actually not just tribal owned, but it's also tribal led. So that has had its challenges for sure, but also it's been very rewarding work because people are very excited to come to work every day and be a part of something that they're proud of and work towards something and understand that the products that are on the market, they take a lot of pride in those things and knowing that they're putting those good products out there, but also that the economic benefit that's coming from this isn't just going back to investors, it's going back to their community. So it really creates a whole different mindset and leadership mentality within an organization where the whole drive is to create jobs, create career paths, and create economic improvements for a community versus just trying to make whoever invested in it a lot more money and more wealthy. So that's been kind of the cool part, I think, of working with the tribes.
Yeah, that's great. So how long have you been overall working with the tribes? Because I know you said Minnesota about 4 years ago. Has this been a much longer sort of endeavor? I think, again, great to be putting that investment in, but would love to just know how that even came about.
Yeah, we started working with tribes back in like 2016,
Oh,
out in Washington. We've worked down in New Mexico, out in New York, Illinois, Minnesota, obviously. So it's been we've kind of become known in that space, and it does take a while to gain the trust, and just overall the amount of time these projects take to get them to a point of success.
yeah,
Uh, it's taken us a while, to really kind of build a reputation for ourselves in those communities. But now we're absolutely one of the first groups that people look to, or tribes look to be able to support them in that, just in the way that we've been able to execute, and I think more so in the way that we're able to work within those communities, and
yeah,
make sure that they're being heard and their vision is heard, and we're not just trying to do what we've done before, but we're trying to make it theirs. And that's kind of been what I think has allowed us to be a little bit different in the space and stand out.
yeah. I think being able to build something for them that has a self sufficiency element and, like you're saying, be a point of pride. I think for your community is a big difference and a big differentiator. You had kind of mentioned some of the setups and the programs. Out of curiosity, in terms of tailoring the projects for these different tribes, I know that it can vary, obviously, footprint by footprint, group by group. But is it more kind of full scale with these tribes versus with more traditional MSOs, or what's sort of the difference in terms of scale of the projects, or how is it getting tailored ultimately to that segment?
Yeah, so a little bit different for the tribes, since they are sovereign in these states that have cannabis programs. They choose to set up their program, and it goes kind of one of two directions from the beginning: is do you want to be a part of the state program, or do you just want to have your own program? Because if you're going to have your own program, then you can cultivate, manufacture, sell product wherever on your tribal land, versus if you wanted to be able to work with the state, or work with state licensed businesses, through like Metric and things like that. That looks a little bit different. You can either just opt in to be a part of the overall program and be regulated by the state, or you can create your own regulations, which oftentimes mirror in a lot of ways the state regulations, but maybe there's certain provisions that allow them to extend their canopy size, or move product a little bit differently, or allow them maybe less transparency or less intervention from the state program, to be able to come in and actually regulate them. Once they've decided on that path, the next piece is to actually put their regulations in place and their cannabis board in place to be able to actually issue the tribal licenses. From there, we're kind of determining what route they want to go. So if they're not going to be a part of the program with the state, they're likely not just going to set up a store, because they still have to create the product to be able to sell. So a lot of those groups that want to do it on their own, generally they are vertically integrated. So they'll cultivate, they'll extract, they'll manufacture, they'll do retail. Those who want to be part of the state program, it becomes a little bit easier for them to determine where the opportunity is within the space, and whether that is the market itself, or the budgets they have, or maybe some of the buildings that they already have on site that would save them some of the capital expenditures that come early on in these projects to set them up. And then
Yeah.
once they decide that, it's all about kind of moving forward. And there's a lot of moving pieces, when you're dealing with bureaucracy and commercial construction and staffing and things like that.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Out of curiosity, is the majority lean towards more state model and supplying for the state, or do the majority just within the own community kind of target there? I would imagine the growth would be more kind of in the wider state to get it available to a larger group of people, but I'm not sure, obviously.
For the most part, I think with the tribes, it's a big spectrum of what the tribes look like. Some of them are run like Fortune 500 companies. Some of them are one or two people just trying to figure out what to do with a piece of land, how to get federal registration, how to get started, and then there's everything in between. So a lot of it, I think, depends on really the tribe's understanding of what they're doing and what the limitations are. finding the right partners to help them understand what the advantages or disadvantages may be of just doing it on sovereign land versus opening up to the state programs. What we've seen mostly in Minnesota, I think, of the tribes, the early movers, has been to negotiate those compact agreements and be part of that program, especially since their ability to have cultivation, have product ready for market as these new retailers are opening was a huge advantage to them. So for Minnesota, it seems that most have opted to try to go the compact agreement, although some of those compacts can get kind of difficult too of what they're willing to share and how they're willing to operate with the state. And the state, obviously, they have feedback on that as well that they want to see in there before they'll sign, because it's a contract between the tribe and the state government.
Totally fair, and forgive it. It's a silly question, but because they're on sovereign land, is there anything that prevents them from applying to multiple different state programs? Just because if they are technically exporting in some ways to a state from sovereign land, is there anything that would prevent them ultimately from exporting across the US?
Right now, yes, there are some people who would debate that. However, once you hit the highway, you're off sovereign land, and that's kind of where the issue exists, is like if you bring it across state lines or you bring it off your sovereign land to somewhere else, then essentially you lose that sovereignty. So right
Thanks.
now it's pretty difficult. There is a tribe kind of that touches Canada, and there's been some things that I've heard have gone on there because they're not actually crossing into other states; they're crossing into another country. But I think all of it is very risky right now.
Yes, I think it's a lot of sort of regulations to try to navigate complex. Maybe if we see interstate, that would be a change for them, but all really interesting. And again, I think I appreciate you kind of taking time to, shine some light into a corner of the cannabis, market that I think a lot of investors out there might not have as much information on. So I think interesting. Great to hear the work that's getting done on that side as well. Would love, just because I know we kind of not buried the lead, but I think there's been a lot of conversation on sort of general rescheduling in the US, kind of how the federal framework might be changing there. Would love to spend some, quick time just getting your views and takes on kind of where we might be when it comes to rescheduling. If you have any thoughts in terms of if this time is different in some ways, just sort of high level, getting a kind of a temp check on where we might be on that front.
Yeah. There's no precise timeline on rescheduling, and I think with the current administration, like we don't know what's going to happen day to day, week to week. There have been a lot of discussions previously about cannabis being either federally legalized or rescheduled. Our preference, and I feel like a lot of the operators in the industry, our preference is for rescheduling rather than full federal legalization, simply because what generally happens when the federal government gets involved is things take longer and things get more expensive. Whereas right now we could really operate kind of the same way that we are, where each state has the ability to sell the product and create their programs and determine how many licenses are awarded. Similar to the alcohol industry, and some states have very limited amount of alcohol licenses. Some are a little bit more progressive in it. I think that in that way, it's gonna help the current structure of the program continue to not hit any further like large bumps in the road that would slow it down. However, I think for larger operators, there's really an opportunity to take rescheduling and position it as a strategic opportunity and not necessarily a silver bullet. I think a lot of the large operators right now, and really investors kind of feel the same way, is that they're very well positioned. But what we're kind of seeing is that there's still kind of a lack of standardization across all of these territories. And when this rescheduling does happen, it would likely result in some form of consolidation or movement, because you wouldn't necessarily have to have cultivation, extraction, manufacturing all in the same state. You may have that in one state and it just exports, or not exports, but distributes those throughout the other state territories that you're in.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, finding efficiencies in terms of being able to grow where it makes sense to grow, or at least just centralizing your grow into one area feels like a big area of efficiency. It'll be interesting to see what the kind of makeup and map looks like on the other side of rescheduling if we do get there. I am curious though, just because I think one of the main elements, if we were to see rescheduling to reschedule 3 or below, is the doing away of 280E. I know that's been a big focus for investors, for public companies. But curious how it kind of affects the industry in terms of, creating more cash on hand, how that might kind of feed into higher yields, um, ability to help service some of these companies. Kind of what would things look like for you on the other side of that?
280E for us, I don't know how much impact it will. I mean, it's going to have a tremendous financial impact. I think similar to the booms that we see in these new states. But overall, what I think is going to essentially happen is it's just going to drive down the cost of goods. So the products that we pay $40 or $50 an eighth for now, I think those are going to become less expensive because our overall cost for those products is going to go down because of the write-offs that we'll be able to have. So not necessarily uh, a lesser cost of goods, but more so a more efficient means to create those goods at the end of the year when taxes are filed. So I do think it will absolutely have an impact on the industry. I just think it's going to drive us further into the basement as far as prices go, state to state. So I think there will be a little bit of a bump when 280E is removed, but 280E is going to be removed for everyone. So some of these businesses, some of these large operators have actually found ways to kind of use 280E to their advantage. They're still paying in the taxes maybe, but they found advantages and ways to stand out from some of the competition who's maybe not as well versed in how some of those techniques work. And then from a tribe perspective, that's actually one of their biggest advantages, is since they are sovereign. The federal tax code doesn't necessarily apply to them, so they've always had this advantage of not having that. So in any market, essentially, there is a competitive advantage for them there. So the tribes would essentially lose that advantage if 280E does go away.
Interesting. But in terms of like the consulting side of things, I would imagine it brings in a wave of business and I think work to do in terms of breaking down impacts, what it means for these individual companies, whether they're tribal or not, and trying to kind of navigate through how to best reorient in a new kind of world. Is that true? Also, hopefully, if the 280 thing does free up some cash for some of these companies, again, I understand the impacts in terms of driving down prices potentially, but hopefully having more cash on hand could go into something like consulting. Is that true? Is that, I don't know.
Possibly, I think rescheduling would likely negate 280E, and by doing both of those things, it would open up additional interest from the capital and finance side of things. Things would become a lot more affordable. Some of the loans and agreements and equity agreements that we've seen in the space over the last 15 years have been pretty crazy. But also in some of these markets, it still made sense for them. But from the investor standpoint, it's still federally legal, so there's still a big risk there for them. So I think rescheduling and the getting rid of 280E would likely open up the capital side and the banking side of the industry for sure.
Very interesting. All right. Well, so you've been in the cannabis space for a long time now, and I think have seen it go through a lot of different changes and iterations. In terms of where you find yourself now, just from viewing the industry and also, of course, from higher yield consulting, what's your, again, not temp check, but what's your perspective on kind of where we find ourselves now, high level? Are you more excited, less excited? What's sort of your take there?
The last few years have been pretty tough. The industry has kind of hit its peak, I think, here in the U.S. Maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, kind of coming through COVID. Since then, it's been a pretty drastic downturn. We've seen a lot of license holders going out of business. We look at Colorado. I think the amount of cultivations we had 2, 3 years ago, we are at probably less than half of those businesses still existing. So I think overall, as the industry goes, it's been kind of a challenging time and difficult time, especially for people like myself who've been around for a while, because there were other pioneers that I started this with, and to see them, struggling now or going under has been very difficult. However, it continues to kind of drive change and drive innovation of new ways to be successful, new ways to succeed, new ways to be more efficient, new ways to structure the business, new ways to leverage new technology. And that's probably been one of the most interesting things I think about cannabis, is that while we've kind of been this like black sheep industry, we've also been driving all of this indoor farming technology, and without cannabis, it wouldn't be anywhere near where it is today. And I think as an industry, it's something we should be very proud of. But also, I think it's something that as we see these businesses going out, especially these cultivations, of ways to kind of repurpose some of this space to still make a positive community impact to those areas.
Yeah, that's a great driver. Again, I do hope we are entering this kind of new era or new chapter for cannabis. Like you're saying, I do think it is very hard to see people having struggled for a long time where we haven't had, a lot of the regulatory stuff figured out in some ways. And I think that's been hard for operators to operate in those conditions. So hopefully we do see that change and turnover. I do think it's something that the majority of Americans want at least some sort of framework for medical, want easier kind of access to things like that, more research, all of that. So hopefully we do see that happen. And along the way, I know there'll be a lot of efficiencies defined, like you're saying, and a lot of ways to kind of try to figure out how to make sense and orient kind of the new changing map of things. So I think a lot of interesting stuff ahead, hopefully as well for you. I think it seems like there'll be a lot of questions that you can help find answers for and kind of help guide ultimately some of these operators through these changes. We'll have to wait and see, of course, in terms of the timing. I know nobody knows. But hopefully it feels like it's ultimately time for these kind of cannabis to enter into this new chapter. So we'll have to wait and see. But Cory, thanks for kind of breaking down some of these things that are going on, what you're seeing from a consulting perspective. I think very, very helpful. Would love, if people want to learn more, if they want to kind of see some more of the work that you're doing, where would you point them to kind of stay in touch and tune with all things on that?
Yeah, they can call us. Our phone number is 844 high yield, HIYIELD. And then
Nice.
check out our website, www.higheryieldsconsulting.com.
That is perfect. All right. Well, everyone out there, thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate it. Hope you found this insightful and useful. Cory, thanks again. Really appreciate it. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.